Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Those were the words of Jesus Christ, and they echo and resonate throughout this world as they did back in that era. And I know that a lot of you are probably now sitting there wondering, now what is a Viking, a son of Odin, doing talking about Jesus Christ or contemplating the words and teachings of Jesus Christ? But you see, here's the thing. And I don't consider this a weakness to acknowledge that I have great appreciation for Jesus Christ. Now, I know that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily agree on whether he's someone who actually lived or whether he was a fictional character or whatnot, but at least the way he's written and depicted in the Bible, he is about as close to perfect as they come, as a human being could possibly come. Now, what we see as realists in Norse culture is that sadly, we have to acknowledge the fact that all of us live in a world that has us in it. And most of us are about as far from Jesus Christ as we could possibly be. Though certainly, according to religious practices, you might aspire to be somewhat closer to what he was. And, well, looking at the Christian world, well, certainly in our time, we might ask ourselves, so how well are we doing with that? How well are Christians doing in terms of being closer to Jesus or closer to God? And that is certainly a question. Now, the reason for why I bring this up, and I'm trying to stay on point with this, is that I wrestle a lot with these two conflictious ideas. So one of the ideas is Jesus' idea of turning the other cheek, which is beautiful and strong and bold and daring because you're giving an open invitation to someone who did you wrong to repeat that offense with you knowing and him knowing that you know that he's doing wrong, and you're saying, do that again, please. It's a powerful statement if you're dealing with someone who has a sense of morality and a sense of remorse. Because quite frankly, if you turn the other cheek in the face of a tyrant or in the face of someone who has no sense of remorse or regret or anything over what they just did to you, they're very likely to laugh in your face and hit you again. And the Norse know this. But you see, there's a balance, because on the opposite end of all of this, and the other far extreme is ultimate revenge. And for all of his faults, because Mahatma Gandhi was not a man without fault by any stretch of the imagination, but for all of his faults, he had a point when he said, an eye for an eye would turn the whole world blind. So, quite frankly, if we operate from a mode of retaliating with ultimate revenge, it's just a matter of time until there aren't really any of us left to tell the story. So, where exactly do we reside between these opposite extremes? Because here's the other idea that I want to toss into this little mix to make it a little bit more complicated. You see, even as moral as we might be, as good as our sense of right or wrong might be, the capacity of the human being to justify its own actions, justify its own behavior, is mind-boggling, baffling, absolutely baffling. The amount of mental gymnastics and cognitive acrobatics that you can do to justify why you do something onto someone else or put an action out into this world, knowing, or sometimes actually, and this is the more dangerous part, not knowing that that action, once you put it out there, is a ball that's going to roll. And this is a lot of what I do in my life, in my work, in my day, is computing the effects of human behavior, human action, if you will. So I take this cycle of cause and effect. So somebody does something that affects someone over here. triggering a reaction or a response in that person, and that action then bounces off, so forth and so on. So I build these little cycles of experimentation, and compute these games to see where the causal cycles of behavior may or may not, and this is also very much a theoretical field, may or may not calm down, and what the byproduct that you might not anticipate might be of your actions. And quite frankly, most we do with words, with our passive behavior, our mechanics, or our intentions. We do a lot of actions in this world every day. We say things, we do things. A lot of them are intended, a lot of them are unintended. And as are the consequences. Many of the consequences are intended, many are unintended. You'd be freaked out, by the way, if you knew the product of your unintended actions and the unintended consequences that occur and arise from your actions. You'd be baffled if you knew, because quite frankly, none of us knows even a tiny fraction of it. Because often a time, people wouldn't take their time to come up to us and actually tell us. And if they do, well, what happens? We're most likely to lash out at them, while in actuality, if we have any capacity and humility to introspect, we should say, why, thank you. I was not aware of that. I wasn't aware of the fact that I was doing that. And where can I take a lesson? Does this come more out of what I did and didn't intend to do? Or does that outcome come more out of that person's interpretation of what I said or did? How they perceive my action? That is also a question. And we don't always agree on that. Whether or. Source of conflict for human beings. Conflict's a beautiful thing. It makes us destroy things, and it makes us create things. Funny how this goes around, doesn't it? We're so vivid, humanity. But yeah, so to get back on point, I really wrestle with this because, in some ways, intentionally putting bad actions out into the world, it's an ugly practice. And whenever that does come back to us, and it will, it's probably very much deserved. But at the same time, just constantly letting go this, I get this idea for the self and for our own peace of mind and peace of soul. I get this idea that being able to let go of something is something truly beautiful, and it's more for us than for them. But at the same time, if we don't put our foot down, if we don't say, enough is enough, I'm not going to allow you to behave like this, if we don't set boundaries for not just ourselves, but also for others, then we're technically rewarding bad behavior. You see, by way of my morality, I have a certain barrier that prohibits me from behaving actively and intentionally behaving in a certain way and doing certain bad things unto others. That is my internal boundary. And then there are the external boundaries. So what I would allow myself to do unto others, if that is not welcomed by them, then they will set the internal boundaries and tell me, you know what, you cannot steamroll over me like that. May or may not be fair. I might consider that fair or not. But that is then my opinion versus their opinion. But when you're dealing with people, as we so often do in this world, who have absolutely no internal barrier, or whose internal barrier is, well, quite frankly, stripped to a way, or in a way that troubles us greatly, then is it right of us to just say, well, they're gonna get what's coming their way at some point? I really grasp. I'm really torn with that idea, because in a way, what will eventually teach those people the lesson that no, this is not okay, is if someone actually just puts the barrier. Now, if you do consider yourself a strong and powerful and able-bodied or able-minded person, if you consider yourself that fit and fit enough to recognize that there should be a barrier there, then wouldn't you also consider yourself fit enough to place that barrier there? And then if you, as a skilled and able and fit human being, do not place that barrier, who else will? Are we all just going to sit by and say, no, somebody else is going to take care of it. Somebody else is going to take care of it. You know, justice doesn't happen unless we say, you know what, justice needs to happen. And then, of course, there's the even bigger question. Are we right in that specific moment or circumstance? Are we right? Because if you're not right, you better say all your prayers, because that's really going to come back and haunt you. And yeah, and that notion is also scary and daring and everything. You know, it's risky to go out there and say, you know what, I'm going to put an end to this. Because who the heck are you to judge? Who am I to judge, for that matter? So yeah, so this is something that I really, really wrestle with cognitively. Because I know there's an Aristotelian happy medium there. There's an optimum. There are these two little lines that draw an X somewhere. There is an Aristotelian happy medium, or an equilibrium, or an optimum, if you will. The reason for why there are so many words to describe this from so many fields is because this is very much an engineering and a mathematical reality, that there is an equilibrium in everything somewhere. So Aristotle had very much the right idea. Too little is bad, too much is bad, there's a happy medium. And in this case, turning the other cheek when you're dealing with someone who has no sense of remorse isn't helpful. It can be self-destructive and pathological upon yourself, and thus not good for the world. It's not rewarding good in this world to allow the bad to just steamroll over everything that is beautiful and pure and nice and neat in this world. It's not right. But at the same time, ultimate backlash and retaliation and pure revenge upon every tiny little thing, it's also not good. You know, just because we're not going to reward evil, returning the favor by putting 10 times the amount of evil back, it's not going to do it. It's just going to amplify. It's going to serve as an amplifier for evil actions and bad behavior in the world. Well, then we could also say the happy medium would be to punish it with just the right amount. So, just level it. It's like in self-defense. Somebody attacks you and they hit you. Well, maybe shooting them dead with a gun is excessive force or excessive self-defense. But see, here's the thing: you never really know. It's hard to, because you're dealing with time. That is a bit of an abstraction here. You're dealing with time as well, so you can't always know what is just enough, what is just right. So somebody, let's say, for argument, somebody comes and punches me in my face, and I punch him back to teach him a lesson, and it's quick. It's done right there. I leveled it out equally. What if that person, if they didn't have the sense of initiating force is bad, evil, what if that person's like, rather than taking the lesson, their ego is hurt, their pride is hurt, they consider their honor to be hurt, and they go, okay, I'm leaving this, and they go back somewhere, and they plot against me, and then at some point down the line, they come to my house, they knock in the door, and they do all sorts of crazy things. Not just affecting me, but also affecting my family. Maybe putting my children in danger. Now, what is that? So, there's also that when you decide to put the foot down to construct this barrier. on the spot. Is there going to be a byproduct of that down the line, down the sands of time? It's hard to deal with time and space because there are only two out of the people take this idea of the dimensions that we live in to all sorts of ways these days. Some with, I think, very justified by demonstrable physical laws, and maybe some might be pseudo physics. I'm not really a physicist, so I wouldn't know. I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but these two dimensions that we most often talk about, time and space, they're very tricky. Often at times, they're very tricky, especially when we're trying to foresee the product of behavior, of action, reaction, of words, of ideas. Some ideas, when they're put out, they put themselves into motion. They take on a life of their own, and they're like a moving force, with or without our participation. These are so complicated matters, and I guess the reason for why I'm bringing this up and ranting about it is just to toss that out there for a thought exercise. How what's the best way for us to participate in our everyday interactions in a way that helps the world self-regulate in a more constructive manner, helps humanity self-regulate in a more constructive manner. Because quite frankly, and you see this already around 2 years old, kids will start all sorts of things to test their boundaries. And of course, if you as a parent don't put any boundaries there, or you're going to have a kid that thinks they can just go through their entire life just steamrolling with doing whatever they please all over everybody. And, at some point down the line, that poor soul, because it's not their fault if that's your parenting, that is not their fault. But at some point, the world is going to teach them that lesson. And it's going to be ugly. Because they're going to meet someone who's going to just really firmly put that down, or they're going to manage to walk all over someone, and then when that person realizes it, they're going to go, that wasn't right, and they're going to go back and retaliate, and you're going to have that door storming down and somebody rushing into your home or whatnot. But by whichever means, when people don't have a sense of that barrier, it can come back in a very ugly fashion, very ugly manner. So not putting boundaries for the kid is about the most destructive things you can do to that child, in my humble opinion. No, I know I'm not a parental expert as well, but I've seen people go from being kids to being adults. I've seen the blueprint of a life progressing, and this is another thing that I get a sense that we really don't study this well enough when we study history. We look at all these people who did good things or bad things or were notorious for, some reason or another throughout history. And we see that action. We see, when they emerged and arrived onto the scene, if you will, into power and what they did. It's very easy to judge those actions, and I'm not saying we shouldn't judge those actions, because quite frankly, it's healthy to have a little bit of judgment about that. If somebody is butchering a whole bunch of people, it's not a good thing. But there's something about looking at the blueprint, what they developed out of. How much do we know about their parents and things around their birth, the prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal, like all these things, and then of course their early life and upbringing. How much do we know about all of that, and how can fields come together and collaborate, and we can see how they developed and why they developed to become and do what they became and what they did. And especially these days, Genghis Khan is coming. He repeatedly keeps coming back into discussion. Now, I'm biased. I'm very likely a descendant of his. according to what the best of what I can find. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that killing every tribe that didn't just surrender and join your empire, it's a ruthless thing to do. It's a horrible, horrible thing to do, to just say join or die. It's a horrible thing. But at the same time, he wasn't the start of that code of conduct, if you will. The steppes were always like that, way before him. When his father was killed by his adversaries and enemies, and generations before that again. What Genghis did, and this is what Russia learned and understood, and why Russia expanded to the east again. Because what Genghis did in the beginning is that he demonstrated to us that, unless you build and expand onto the entire steppes and put a dome, if you will, of rules and authority on top of them, it's always going to be a clash. So basically, he, by way of destroying everything and everyone in his path, he was the first one to achieve peace across the Eurasian steppes, from Russia in the west all the way out to the Pacific and down to China. For that tiny little bit, until his descendants started feuding and rivaling with each other. For that tiny little bit, those steppes had the most amount of peace they had probably ever seen. So, when you grow up like he did in a world that had been generations of these small nomadic tribes attacking each other, and you don't know if you're going to wake up in the middle of a night to some enemy tribe rushing through your portable village of tiny yurts, killing your family. It's a very intense and disturbing environment. It's high intensity. You're constantly under that threat. You're aware of your mortality 24/7. There's no such thing as a peace of mind, no such thing as safety. And this echoes with the Norse experience. Tribal rivalries in Scandinavia and the Baltic and around that entire region, especially during the migration era, its most overlooked effect on the emergence of the Viking Age, the fall of the Roman Empire, and the migration era in the the 400s and 300s and 400s, I believe. I think it's the 4th and 5th century. But yeah, from the time when the tribes are coming in from the east, you have the Huns coming in, the Alans, the Avars, all of these tribes, and you have the migration of the Germanic tribes pushing down onto the continent. You have Rome collapsing just as much from the inside as from these outside forces, and you have all these clashes and trading routes being blocked, and you have the Scandinavian and Baltic regions sitting up there, and they can't trade down for what they need, and they're still going through population booms, and all of a sudden food gets scarce, and again food gets scarce, and you can't trade what you have way too much of, like amber and lumber and these things. You can't trade those things for grain or food or wine or what have you, because there's a feud going on down in the continent. That can very much inspire a culture to build a sense of what we probably is the core idea, the strongest idea in Norse mythology, that sense of Norse fatalism. It's certainly one that people, when they study Norse mythology, talk about quite a bit. This idea that what's the best way to articulate it? That anyway, glorifies your death, in a sense, glorifies it in the eyes of the gods, that you go out to battle, and if that battle claims your life, that is a good thing, because you get to rest with Odin, feast with Odin, and fight with other great warriors in his halls till the end of the world, till you fight that last battle alongside him, the patron god, in Ragnarok. That's somewhat of an idea. in a way makes you very invincible. It's like, if I'm going into battle, if I die, it's good. If I live, woo, it's good. It means I can go and do another battle. Do this thing all over again. So makes you a bit invincible. But yeah, if you're forced to be aware of your own mortality 24/7 and you can't get a peace of mind, then it's certainly understandable that those kind of ideas, cultures with those approaches come to be, not only to construct these psychological self defense mechanisms, but also to reinforce the sense of necessity for survival in a very, very harsh environment. And no wonder they expanded. All of these cultures, they had that in common. They went into hyper expansion mode. Mongols did that. The Huns did that. The Norse did that. Some other Germanic tribes did that before as well. But their precise religious practices we know less of. A lot of people and some scholars will just try and toss all these Germanic belief systems into the same thing. I just don't know if we can be intellectually honest and do that. There's quite a bit of difference in many ways between the Norse and some of the South Germanic tribes in a lot of sense. So I don't know to which degree it's intellectually honest to just toss them together and proclaim that they believe the same or in the same fashion. But yeah, there's a huge food for thought there. What's the balance between turning the cheek, or turning the other cheek? I'm sorry, and punishing someone for wrongdoings, setting a barrier, not allowing people to just steamroll all across the world as they please. Where is the medium? How can we read that in every given situation? And it's tough. It's very tricky. I wrestle with it. I also wrestle with what's right or wrong. Am I right to judge? Am I right to take action? And if I take no action, because inaction is also action. So if I take no action, is that morally wrong in that situation? So I have to debate this with myself constantly, every day, often at times. I still make the mistake of, allowing people to do more harm than I should allow them in my presence and upon me, and that is just as immoral. So yeah, so we have to draw lines, but how do we become good at drawing lines in a manner that our practice of drawing lines is not creating more evil, more bad? It's tricky. It's a tricky process, and I think it's in many ways an eternal work in progress for those of us who aspire to practice it or try to the best of our abilities. Anyways, this rant has gone on for way, way too long. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope you took away enough to justify the time I took away from you throughout this. So on that note, Viking out.